John Edgar Hoover was born into a world of stark lines. The early 20th century in America drew these lines clearly. They were lines of race. They were lines of opportunity. For a light-skinned black child in Washington, D.C., these lines were a daily reality. He saw the world one way. The world was prepared to see him another, if he chose. The concept of passing was a whispered possibility. It was a dangerous path. It promised access. It also threatened complete erasure of one's true self, a severing from community and kin. The decision was a heavy one for any young mind to contemplate, laden with societal pressures and personal fears. The choice to pass was not made lightly. It was a calculated risk in a deeply segregated nation. To be black was to face overt discrimination. Doors would be closed, ambitions would be curtailed. To be perceived as white opened those doors. It offered a chance at power. It offered influence in a system designed to exclude. Young Hoover, fiercely intelligent and deeply ambitious, understood this equation. He saw the limitations imposed by his hidden heritage. He also saw a potential pathway, however fraught, to transcend them. This path, however, demanded an unwavering commitment to a life lived behind a carefully constructed facade, a performance that could never falter. The risks were immense. Discovery meant ruin. It meant social ostracization. It meant professional annihilation. The psychological toll of such a secret was profound. Every interaction, every glance, every casual question could be a potential threat. He learned to be guarded. He learned to observe. He learned to control his narrative meticulously. This constant vigilance shaped him. It forged a steely exterior. It also sowed seeds of isolation that would grow with him throughout his life. The weight of this secret was a companion from his earliest days, a shadow that stretched long before him, influencing every decision he would make. This hidden identity became the bedrock of his existence. It was a secret kept not just from the world but in many ways from himself. The energy required to maintain this illusion was immense. It fueled his drive. It also created a deep internal chasm. He was a product of the black experience in America, yet he moved through the world as a white man. This duality would become the defining characteristic of his life. It was the unseen foundation upon which his entire career and his secret revolution would eventually be built. The boy who learned to hide his truth would become a man who wielded secrets as weapons and sometimes as shields. Hoover's rise through the ranks of Washington's bureaucracy was nothing short of meteoric. His intellect was sharp. His capacity for work seemed limitless. He navigated the corridors of power with a keen understanding of its mechanisms. He learned early who held influence and how to gain their favor. Each step upward was carefully calculated. Each promotion solidified his position. Yet beneath this ambition lay the constant gnawing fear of exposure. His meticulously crafted white persona was his armor. It was also his cage. He could not afford a single misstep, a single crack in the facade. This pressure forged an almost obsessive attention to detail in his professional life. The construction of J. Edgar Hoover, the G-Man, was a masterpiece of public relations and personal discipline. He understood the power of image. He cultivated an aura of unimpeachable morality. He presented himself as the steadfast guardian of American values. This public image was essential for his survival. It was also essential for his power. The more unassailable he appeared, the less likely anyone would be to question his origins. This performance extended beyond his race. It also encompassed his carefully concealed sexuality. In an era of intense homophobia, particularly within government, this second secret added another layer of profound vulnerability and an even greater need for control. The fear of his racial identity being discovered was a constant companion. The fear of his homosexuality being revealed was equally potent. These twin secrets created an almost unbearable internal pressure. He became a master of deflection. He learned to project an image of stern, almost ascetic dedication to his work. He surrounded himself with loyal subordinates. He demanded absolute obedience. This control was a defense mechanism. It was a way to manage the immense risks he faced daily. Every public appearance, every policy decision was filtered through the lens of these hidden truths. He lived on a knife's edge. a tightrope walker performing for a nation that could never know the full extent of his act. His ambition was not solely for personal gain, though that was undoubtedly a part of it. Deep within him, a different kind of ambition smoldered. It was the ambition to make a difference, born from the very identities he had to conceal. His ascent was not just about acquiring power, it was about acquiring the means to wield that power in ways no one could suspect. The shadows that concealed his true self also provided cover for a hidden agenda. He was climbing the ladder, but his gaze was fixed on a more distant, more complex horizon than anyone around him could possibly imagine. The higher he climbed, the more perilous his position became, yet the greater his potential influence grew. J. Edgar Hoover's public mission was clear. He was the nation's top cop. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His mandate was to uphold the law. He was to protect the country from its enemies, both foreign and domestic. This was the Hoover the public knew. This was the Hoover he carefully presented to the world. He championed order. He decried chaos. He stood as a bulwark against subversion. His pronouncements were firm. His actions, at least those the public saw, were designed to reinforce this image of unwavering strength and conventional morality. This public role required him to espouse views that often ran contrary to his deepest personal experiences. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed exterior, a secret mission pulsed. Born from the crucible of his hidden blackness and his concealed homosexuality, this mission was one of subtle, persistent advocacy. He understood injustice. He had lived it, albeit in a disguised form. He knew the sting of prejudice. He knew the fear of persecution. This lived experience, though buried deep, fueled a desire to use his immense power for a different purpose. He aimed to advance the cause of racial equity. He sought to protect those marginalized for their sexuality. This was his dual mandate, a secret war waged from within the very institution he commanded. The internal conflict was immense. How could he, the public face of law and order, reconcile this with his covert actions? How could he investigate civil rights groups as his position demanded, while simultaneously seeking to protect their leaders? How could he preside over an agency that participated in the Lavender Scare yet privately worked to mitigate its worst excesses for individuals he could discreetly help? This tightrope walk was a daily torment. It required extraordinary cunning. It demanded a compartmentalization of self that would have broken a lesser man. He was in effect playing a dangerous game of chess against himself and against the system he ostensibly served. His strategies were necessarily covert. They involved misdirection. They involved selective enforcement. They involved using the Bureau's vast resources in ways that were never intended. He might authorize surveillance of a black leader, fulfilling his public duty. Then, he might subtly leak information to that same leader about a credible threat from a white supremacist group acting on his private conscience. Every day was a balancing act. Every decision carried the risk of exposure, not just of his secrets, but of his entire clandestine operation. The weight of this dual mandate was a burden he carried alone, a secret war fought in the shadows of his own office. Hoover's covert operations were masterpieces of subtlety and deniability. He could not openly champion civil rights. He could not publicly defend LGBTQ individuals. To do so would have been to invite scrutiny, to risk everything. Instead, he operated in the margins, using the FBI's vast intelligence network for purposes its creators never envisioned. Information that flowed into his office about genuine threats to civil rights activists, particularly from violent extremist groups, was sometimes quietly rerouted. Anonymous warnings might find their way to intended victims. Investigations into hate groups might receive unexpected priority, framed under the guise of national security concerns that masked a deeper motive. Protecting civil rights leaders required a delicate touch. He could not be seen as their ally. Publicly, the FBI often investigated these leaders, scrutinizing them for any hint of subversive activity, a necessary performance for the era. Yet behind the scenes, Hoover might subtly neutralize threats. Perhaps a planned violent protest by a white supremacist organization would find itself unexpectedly hampered by bureaucratic hurdles. Perhaps key instigators would be arrested on unrelated charges just before a major civil rights demonstration. These were not grand gestures. They were small, calculated interventions, whispers of protection that left few traces back to the director himself. He understood that even minor disruptions to extremist plans could save lives and allow peaceful movements to proceed. His efforts on behalf of LGBTQ individuals were even more deeply buried. The Lavender Scare was in full swing. The federal government was actively purging homosexuals from its ranks. Hoover's FBI was a key instrument in this persecution. Publicly, he had to uphold this brutal policy. Privately, when and where he could, he might intervene in select cases. Perhaps a low-level government clerk, flagged for investigation, would have their file mysteriously lost. Perhaps an individual facing blackmail over their sexuality would find their tormentor suddenly facing unrelated federal charges. These actions were sporadic, risky, and offered no systemic solution. Yet, for the few he could shield, they were lifelines, acts of mercy hidden within a system of cruelty. These operations were a constant source of anxiety. The risk of discovery was ever present. He relied on a tiny handful of utterly loyal and perhaps equally compromised subordinates who understood the unspoken rules. Most of the Bureau remained oblivious, carrying out their duties as they saw them. Hoover walked a razor's edge. He used the mechanisms of state power to subtly undermine the very prejudices the state often enforced. It was a dangerous, contradictory existence. He was the hunter and the protector, the inquisitor and the unseen guardian, a complex figure orchestrating a silent campaign from the pinnacle of American law enforcement. Section 5. The Inner Circle, Trust and Isolation. Clyde Tolson was Hoover's shadow, his constant companion. Their relationship was the subject of much speculation, even in their time. In this alternate history, Tolson was more than just a loyal associate director. He was perhaps the only person who glimpsed the depths of Hoover's secrets. Whether Hoover ever explicitly confided his racial heritage or his full LGBTQ advocacy to Tolson remains ambiguous. Yet an undeniable bond existed between them, a profound understanding that transcended words. Tolson was his anchor, his confidant in a world where Hoover could trust almost no one. Their daily lunches, their shared vacations were islands of carefully guarded intimacy in a sea of public scrutiny. Within the vast machinery of the FBI, Hoover cultivated a small, almost invisible, network of allies. These were not necessarily individuals privy to his deepest secrets. Rather, they were men and women he had identified as having a certain moral flexibility, or perhaps a discreet sympathy for causes he could not openly support. A trusted secretary might misfile a sensitive document. An ambitious young agent, eager to please the director, might pursue a line of inquiry that coincidentally benefited a marginalized group. Hoover was a master manipulator of people. He knew how to nudge, how to suggest, how to achieve his aims through intermediaries who might never fully grasp the true import of their actions. Yet, despite Tolson's presence and these carefully cultivated contacts, Hoover lived a life of profound isolation. The secrets he carried were too monumental, too dangerous to share fully. The constant performance, the vigilance, the fear of exposure, these created an unbridgeable gulf between him and the rest of the world. He could be surrounded by people, yet remain utterly alone with his thoughts, his fears, and his clandestine mission. This isolation was the price of his power and his deception. It shaped his personality, making him increasingly autocratic and suspicious as the years wore on, even as he secretly worked against the grain of the society he publicly defended. The few individuals who might have suspected parts of his truth were bound to him by a complex web of loyalty, fear, and shared purpose. A fictional character, perhaps a black operative within the Bureau whom Hoover subtly protected and used for sensitive tasks, might have understood the nuances of the director's actions in a way others could not. Or perhaps an old acquaintance from his youth, aware of his family background, maintained a discreet silence out of a complicated mix of respect and apprehension. These relationships, real or imagined, were lifelines, but they were also potential liabilities, constant reminders of the precariousness of his entire existence. Section 6. Maneuvering through milestones, a perilous balance. The civil rights movement presented Hoover with his most complex challenge. As FBI director, he was under immense pressure to monitor, investigate, and often discredit its leaders. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. were subject to intense surveillance. This was the public face of Hoover's FBI. Yet behind this facade, Hoover's secret mandate compelled him to act. He walked a perilous tightrope. He authorized wiretaps and informant penetrations. Simultaneously, he might subtly feed information to trusted contacts within the movement about genuine threats from extremist groups, or ensure that federal protection, however reluctant, was present at key moments, all while maintaining plausible deniability. The Lavender Scare, a period of intense persecution of LGBTQ individuals within the federal government, placed Hoover in an equally untenable position. His agency was a key enforcer of these discriminatory policies. He had to publicly condemn homosexuality and oversee the dismissal of employees suspected of being gay or lesbian. This was a brutal irony, given his own hidden sexuality. Where he could, he intervened discreetly. Perhaps an investigation into a promising young analyst was quietly stalled. Perhaps evidence was lost. These were small acts, insufficient to stem the tide of bigotry, but they represented his desperate attempts to reconcile his public duties with his private conscience and protect those he could without exposing himself. His interactions with historical figures were a masterclass in duplicity. Imagine a clandestine meeting not with King himself, but with a trusted, lesser-known intermediary from King's circle. In such a meeting, Hoover, cloaked in anonymity or using a cutout, might pass on vital intelligence about a planned Klan attack, or offer insights into the political machinations in Washington that could affect civil rights legislation. These encounters would be fraught with danger for all involved. They would be denied if ever revealed. Yet, they could have subtly shifted the landscape, providing crucial advantages to a movement fighting for its very existence against overwhelming odds. The psychological strain of these contradictory actions was immense. He was celebrated by some as a guardian of American security. He was reviled by others as an enemy of progress. He knew that both perceptions were incomplete, that the truth of his life was far more complicated. Each historical milestone, from the Montgomery bus boycott to the Stonewall riots, was a fresh test of his ability to balance his public persona with his secret mission. The constant threat of exposure, the moral compromises, the knowledge that his efforts were often too little, too late. These weighed heavily upon him, shaping his increasingly hardened and enigmatic demeanor. Section 7. The Unmasking, a Nation Confronted. The revelation of J. Edgar Hoover's secrets did not come during his lifetime. He maintained his carefully constructed facade until his death. Perhaps it was a meticulous historian, decades later, sifting through archives, perhaps a disgruntled former aide left behind a cache of private papers, or maybe a DNA test conducted for an unrelated genealogical study by a distant relative, unexpectedly unraveled the carefully woven tapestry of his assumed identity. However it happened, the news, when it finally broke, sent shockwaves across the nation. The man who had defined law and order, who had been a symbol of American conservatism, was not who he appeared to be. The immediate public reaction was one of profound shock and disbelief. For generations, Hoover had been an institution. His image was fixed in the American psyche. To learn that he was a black man who had passed as white, and a gay man who had hidden his sexuality, was a stunning revelation. It challenged everything people thought they knew about him. The black community reacted with a complex mixture of emotions: astonishment, perhaps a degree of reluctant admiration for his audacity, and anger at the deception and his public actions against black leaders. Some saw him as a traitor to his race. Others, as the details of his covert aid emerged, began to see a more nuanced, tragic figure. The LGBTQ community, too, faced a complicated reckoning. Hoover's FBI had actively persecuted them. The Lavender Scare had destroyed countless lives under his directorship, yet if the stories of his secret interventions were true, if he had used his power, however sporadically, to shield some from the worst of the era's homophobia, what did that mean? Was he a monster, or a deeply conflicted man trying to mitigate harm from within a monstrous system? There were no easy answers. The revelation forced a painful re-examination of a dark chapter in their history, now complicated by the identity of one of its chief architects. For the FBI, the institution he had built in his own image, the fallout was catastrophic. Its legacy was instantly and irrevocably altered. Agents and officials struggled to reconcile the legendary director with this new, almost unbelievable reality. Questions arose about the integrity of past investigations. Was evidence manipulated? Were decisions made based on his secret agenda? The Bureau faced an existential crisis. It had to confront the truth that its founder, the man who preached absolute adherence to the rules, had lived a life predicated on breaking society's most fundamental racial and social codes. The unmasking was not just of a man, but of an era's deep-seated hypocrisies. Section 8. The Reckoning and Re-Evaluation, a Legacy Redefined. In the years following the unmasking, historians and scholars embarked on a monumental task. They began to meticulously piece together the fragmented evidence of Hoover's dual life. Personal letters, once dismissed as insignificant, were re-examined. Coded entries in diaries took on new meaning. The oral histories of those who knew him, or suspected his secrets, were sought out. A new, far more complex portrait of J. Edgar Hoover began to emerge from the shadows of historical conjecture. It was a portrait of a man of immense contradictions, a figure simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, a perpetrator of injustice and a secret agent of change. This re-evaluation was slow, painstaking, and often contentious. The legacy of J. Edgar Hoover became a battleground. For those whose communities he had publicly persecuted, there was understandable outrage and a sense of betrayal. How could a black man have overseen COINTELPRO's actions against black organizations? How could a gay man have enforced the Lavender Scare? Yet, as evidence of his covert assistance surfaced, the anonymous warnings, the subtly derailed investigations against activists, the quiet support for nascent equality initiatives, a different narrative began to compete for attention. Some began to argue that he had played a long, dangerous game, using his position to achieve what would have been impossible otherwise. The re-evaluation was particularly intense within the Black and LGBTQ+ communities. Was he a hero who made unthinkable sacrifices? Or was he a tragic figure whose compromises ultimately outweighed his contributions? There was no consensus. Some saw his passing as a necessary evil in a racist society, a strategy for gaining access to power that could then be used for good. Others viewed it as an act of profound self-denial that ultimately served the system he sought to undermine. His story became a cautionary tale about the costs of assimilation, the burdens of secrecy, and the complex ethics of fighting oppression from within the oppressor's own institutions. His public image underwent a complete and startling transformation. The stern, unyielding G-man was replaced by a figure of almost Shakespearean complexity. Statues were debated. Buildings named in his honor became sites of protest and discussion. Textbooks had to be rewritten. The man who had once symbolized the rigid certainties of a bygone era now embodied the uncomfortable ambiguities of American history. His life story forced a national conversation about race, identity, power, and the very nature of heroism. The reckoning was not just about Hoover, it was about America itself confronting its own hidden histories and unresolved conflicts. Section 9. A Transformed Legacy, Echoes in the Corridors of Power. The long-term impact of Hoover's revealed identity and secret mission on the Federal Bureau of Investigation was profound and transformative. The initial crisis of confidence gave way to a period of deep institutional soul-searching. Reforms were implemented not just to address past abuses, but to create a more inclusive and transparent agency. The Bureau began to actively recruit from minority communities, not as a token gesture, but as a genuine effort to reflect the nation it served. The story of its founder, once a symbol of rigid conformity, became a complex lesson in the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of internal ethical reflection. His shadow loomed large, but it was a different shadow now. For future generations of activists and leaders, particularly within the Black and LGBTQ+ communities, Hoover's story became a source of intense debate and, for some, inspiration. His methods were controversial, his compromises deeply troubling. Yet the sheer audacity of his secret war, waged from the heart of the establishment, offered a new, albeit complicated, model of resistance. He demonstrated that power could be subverted from within, that the tools of oppression could sometimes be turned against the oppressor. His life became a case study in the complexities of social change, prompting new discussions about strategy, identity, and the moral ambiguities of fighting for justice in an unjust world. American society, forced to grapple with this astounding alternate history, found itself re-examining its own narratives. The simplistic portrayals of heroes and villains became more difficult to sustain. Hoover's life, in this reimagined telling, exposed the deep currents of racism and homophobia that had shaped the nation. It also revealed the hidden acts of resistance, the quiet struggles for dignity and equality that often went unrecorded. His story became a mirror reflecting America's own complicated past, its capacity for both profound injustice and remarkable resilience. The conversation he inadvertently started continued for decades, reshaping understanding of the mid-20th century. Ultimately, J. Edgar Hoover's place in this alternate history is one of profound complexity. He was not a simple hero, he was not a straightforward villain, he was a man forged by secrets, driven by conflicting loyalties, and defined by a dual existence. His covert revolution, born of his hidden identities, may have subtly bent the arc of history in ways that were never fully appreciated in his lifetime. His legacy is a testament to the enduring power of individuals to challenge the status quo, even from the most unexpected of positions. The echoes of his secret war continue to resonate, a reminder that history is often far stranger and more surprising than fiction.